let me take that book then, because with an anecdote. After it came out in, what was it, in 91, Harper got a protest from somebody who was obviously an enthusiastic person about biographies. He said the last biography he had loved was by Chopin. So he got this from me for biography. And he complained formally to the editors at Harper that he didn't get into he didn't meet Jesus till about page 230 or something like that. So they sent it to me, and I wrote to him because I want to explain to him that that was exactly the difference, that everyone began with Jesus from the Gospels, and I think never got to Jesus, and I began with history and then got to Jesus. So basically, my method, now, part of which, I don't want to get too much out of biography, but as most people know, I went to a boarding school in Ireland, got 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin. So I read Virgil's Aeneid. I was reading it in Latin, okay, but you can read it in English, get the same point, before I ever got to the gospel. Now, that had nothing to do with me being intelligent or brilliant. It just was everyone had to go to this school in Donegal. If they wanted to go to high school, it was left over by England when the empire left. It left a school there that had a curriculum like as good as you can get anywhere in England, in the great schools of so-called public schools of England. So I got that. So I read Virgil before I ever got to the New Testament. And honestly, I think, forget Latin, do it in English. I think that nobody should get to read the New Testament before they get to read Virgil, because then they get the first thing. You begin with history. Now, that was accidental. I don't want to let on that I was any way brilliant. Now, the second thing was that I went into a monastery. And so the monastery decided, well, you're going to be a professor. Okay, fine. And you're going to get a doctorate in theology. They decided that. Forget the Bible. You're going to get a doctorate in theology. We want you to get your theology first. Okay. Then they sent me to Rome for 2 years in exegesis, and then to Jerusalem for 2 years in archaeology. They gave me a magnificent training historically, geographically too, archaeologically, any term you want to use. And I appreciate it really for that. So here's my first advice. First of all, know your sources. That's what I call due diligence. Know your sources. That's the first thing. Know your Roman sources. Within them, know your Jewish sources. And within that, know your gospel sources. I didn't go from the gospel outwards. I came from history inward. I came from the matrix, because it's terribly dangerous to start with the gospel, then picking this little bit, that little bit to help you. You really begin with the outside. It's like those Russian dolls, the outside one should be Rome. Then you're looking at the Romanization of the homeland. And within the Romanization of the homeland, you're looking at Jesus. So know your sources. Now, one other thing about the sources, the gospel. Imagine you were a lawyer and you're working on an accident, a crash, a car crash, let's say, and you have 4 witnesses. And you're happy because you got 4 witnesses. So you're going to be ready for your suit and everything else. And just before you go into court, oh, by the way, your 4 witnesses are called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by coincidence. And just before you go into court, you find out that this guy, Mark, met with Matthew and Luke and had a beer with them, and he told them about the accident. And right next at another table, listening to them, didn't know them, is a guy called John, and he hears the whole story. So now I'm walking in to court, and I got only 1 witness. That's the situation, basically, you have in the gospel versions. And if you don't like it, please take it up with God. It wasn't my idea. If I'd been in charge, you'd get 1 story and 1 story only, and I'd be out of a job. Mark is the major source. I leave everything out for the moment. Is the major source for Matthew and Luke, and there's a massive consensus of that. And it's more controversial. Is John completely independent, or partially independent, or dependent? You have to make your own decision on that. So my advice, if you want to know your sources, read them in parallel columns. Read them horizontally, not vertically. Read them like that, and it'll jump out and hit you what Matthew is doing to Luke, what Matthew is doing to Mark, what Luke is doing. You can watch them change. That's rock bottom basic for me. So if you say to me, how do I know Matthew didn't say this? Because I was watching him copying Mark, and he suddenly added that in. No, I don't think he did new archival work. I think he just changed Mark. So that's knowing your sources. It's almost like preliminaries. It's before you even get going, to be honest with you. And it would be completely different if we had 4 totally independent people trying to give you the good news, which is, of course, interpretation. But at least then you'd have 4 independent vectors. Now, the second thing is a principle. Begin with history. Now, I'm very serious about this. For example, don't begin by reading Mark. Let's say Mark is the earliest of the 4 Gospels, all right? I don't mean that Mark is... If you see what Matthew and Luke do to Mark, you must begin to wonder, what did Mark do to Mark's sources? Okay, even if you don't have them. But don't begin with Mark. Begin with history. No, you don't have to read an awful lot to know. Okay, you're in the Romanization of the Jewish homeland, as I mentioned. Fine focusing down. You're past the time of Herod the Great, who Romanized basically the south with the temple in Caesarea. And you're in Galilee under his son Antipas. And you find that Antipas, around the year 20 in round numbers, changes his capital from Sepphoris inland to lakeside Tiberias. Now, if you're thinking, and that's always a danger when you're doing gospel criticism, you should wonder, why did he change his capital? Because if you really want to, excuse me, piss everyone off, try changing your capital. So you have to come up with a reason. My reason is he's commercializing the lake. I won't get into the reasons for that, but that he's out there to commercialize the lake, get dried fish, salted fish, and all of that into the Mediterranean globalization of the economy. That's his program. Now, I fill that out as much as I can, as thick a description I can get of what Antipas is up to. Then, and only then, I turn, say, to Mark. And lo and behold, the first thing I run into after the overture is fishers. Wow. That's how Jesus got traction. That's how he got going. He may have had the loveliest idea about God's rule on earth, but the prophets had had that for 500 years, more or less. Lovely ideas don't give you traction. People who are angry gives you traction. People who are fishers and had their own boats and now can't launch a boat without paying a tax, and whatever they catch, maybe they have to give it to his Antipas's fish factories. And these are your constituencies. These are the people that know what Rome's rule looks like, and it ain't God's rule, and we did nothing to deserve this. That's how movements start. So watch what I did. I started with history and geography too, as thick as possible. Then I started looking into the New Testament and then going out from there. But the first principle was, if you get your history right, you could get your theology right. If you get your history wrong, you will not get your theology right. You're making it all up. You might get it right by coincidence. It's always possible. It's always possible. Now, let me apply that more closely to, for example, if you've looked already at the first of the 4 videos, you've noticed I don't begin on Easter Sunday, as it were. I don't start into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John on the accounts of what happened on Easter Sunday, the finding of the empty tomb, the visions in Jerusalem, the visions in Galilee, the visions all over the place, actually. I don't begin there. I begin by asking an even more basic question. What models, what metaphors were there if, for example, let me for the moment, as we say in Latin, dato non concesso, which means I won't concede it, but I'll go along with it. Supposing they found an empty tomb, or a tomb emptied on Easter Sunday morning. And supposing they did have, and I do think this did happen, by the way, they had visions of Jesus. I'd be very surprised if they didn't have visions of Jesus, by the way. Now, what models, what metaphors do they have to understand that and to interpret it? They had two. Now, I really let on there. I started with Easter Sunday morning. I didn't. I started back by going into Roman and Jewish theologies, if you will, Roman imperial theology, Jewish covenantal theology, and saying, what did terms like ascension or resurrection? I mean, why do we presume we know what resurrection meant? Oh, that means Jesus coming out of the tomb. No, let me bracket Jesus coming out of the tomb and ask, say, what did Paul, as a Pharisee, mean by it? So I start with history. If you look at the first video, you may be surprised. Why are we talking about ascension and the ascension of Moses and the ascension of Romulus? What's that got to do with anything? And why are we talking about the Maccabees and resurrection and their use of resurrection? Because that's the matrix. That's my favorite word. I don't like to use background or context because you can separate context from text, and we do that very well, and ignore context, or background from foreground and ignore background. Matrix is everything you got to know what's going on. It's as simple as that. You pick up your paper and you read something, and you know what's going. If you know what's going on, you know what it means. If you're in a small town and there's something going on, and the big headline says, "Vote today," well, if you know what's going on, the matrix. It's a nice word too, because it comes from the word that gives us mother in Greek and Latin. So the matrix is everything that's going on into which this fits. If you don't know what's going on, you don't know what's going on. And the idea that we could pick up Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even in English translation, but just Greek just as badly, and know the matrix of 2,000 years ago, why on earth would we presume that? If I go home to Ireland and turn on the television in the hotel room, most of the time I have no idea what's going on. I mean, I know what but I don't know the government daily stuff. So I'm not in the matrix. To know what's going on, I'd have to ask somebody and then get into it. So as a historian, basically, I go for the matrix first, and then I see what fits in the matrix, say, of the 30s. And if it does not fit in the matrix of the 20s and 30s, then it probably comes from the tradition, and that's fine with me, or comes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as a writer. So that's basically the way I go about it. Now, I have been extremely fortunate, I admit, by having an education that got me into the history stuff before I even knew it was history stuff. I thought it was all about declensions and conjugations and not getting hit for not knowing amo, amas, amat, amamas, amatas, amant, and all the rest of the Latin jargon. That's all I thought I was doing. But I was between 11 and 16, so all that stuff got in early. And then, as I said, as a monk, they just sent me around the world, all over the place, because I could stay in monasteries, not expensive. So start with history. That's my advice. Will that get us going?
Oh, yeah. You know, one of the things I would just tell people, if they haven't seen the first time we tried the visual lecture, to go check out the lecture on the boat from Galilee, where you dig in rather deeply to this conversation.
Yeah, it honestly, mean, it was fabulous to see. It's only one boat from the time of Jesus. It proves nothing, you know, but it's a magnificent symbol for me of the economic crunch on the Sea of Galilee, that they try and keep this poor old boat patched and patched and patched, 12 types of wood in it to keep it afloat. And then when they couldn't float anymore, they just sunk it in the mud.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you said there that I think is it can be helpful is that if you begin with the historical sources and then develop the best account you can of the historical matrix, then it's not arbitrary that Jesus' disciples are that the beginning of his ministry and the disciples first come out of the fishermen, because when you understand the historical situation, then they are the optimal people in a sense, where Jesus's own inheritance of the prophetic tradition of Israel, his kind of participatory Pharisaic vision of eschatological practice finds the kind of traction to generate a movement that creates tensions.
And if you think of his two principal disciples, Mary, maybe from Tarichea at least, which is a fishing village, right next to Tiberias. She's probably got the brunt of it. Plunked right next to her is Tiberias. And Peter, of course, from Bethsaida and then Capernaum. His two main disciples, one female, one male, are from fishing villages. So this whole movement is on the northwest quadrant of the Sea of Galilee in the 20s. And you want to say, now that's one heck of a coincidence. Or yeah, they have traditions that go back to Jesus. I'm not alone. So Mark can develop from there. All right, now I let him go out from that. But yeah, that's where I think Jesus must have started if he had a movement that wanted traction.
You know, one of the questions that was repeated coming from different groups was how important the kind of historically grounded understanding of Jesus' vision for the kingdom of God is for understanding what's going on in Passion Week. Like, what is the actual passion of the historical Jesus that drove these kind of prophetic enactments that you kind of walk us through in a previous visual lecture? And one of the questions said, I don't know if Dom meant it this way, but as a conservative Calvinist for most of my life, the three titles that we used in understanding Jesus were prophet, priest, and king. And those were all theological categories that we then read the Gospels to find, oh, here's what it means for Jesus to be prophet, priest, and king. I know Dom has spent time looking at contemporary historical categories for exploring Jesus, be it like peasant and protester, magician and prophet, bandit and messiah, rebel and revolutionary, along with developing comparisons to lower class cynics, philosophical cynics of the time. If you were, and you know where that question's coming from, but for people that might regularly engage the scriptures and have these theological categories from, say, Geneva, right, if you're Reformed, or from Heidelberg, or maybe 19th century liberal Protestantism, if you're me. What can you open up some of those historical categories that might help us re-engage the text, wanting to see Jesus in that historical matrices?
Let me start with those three then. Jesus was not a priest. If you're using a priest in any more specific sense, unless you think everyone is a priest, which is fine. If everyone is a priest, then of course Jesus was a priest. And I don't know, then I'm an ex-priest or a re-priest or what I would be then. Jesus was accepted by many people as the Messiah. I think that's a fact. I don't think Jesus spent much time talking about himself, to be honest with you, because I think Jesus spent most of his time talking about God's rule on earth and telling people that God's rule on earth was here if and only if they participated in its establishment. I think that was Jesus's message. I think that was the core of it. So the last thing Jesus wanted, I suspect, was to get into an argument. Are you really the Messiah? Well, Are you armed, or are you not armed? Or are you a military Messiah or a non-violent Messiah? Or what about stones and sticks? Are they all right? Jesus actually was the unusual type of person who wanted to talk about God, not himself. Now, of course, people are going to say, well, who the heck do you think you are to talk about God? But of course, that's where the traction comes in, because they like what Jesus is saying about God because it works in where they are. It's not, this is what Rome's rule looks like. This is what God's rule looks like. Yeah, it's the traction that's important. And I think Jesus was trying to focus on that. I have no problem historically, whether I can prove it or not, with somebody saying, you know, I think this guy's the Messiah. And somebody else saying, well, I thought the Messiah was going to be like a Davidic warrior. Well, no, he's not. It looks to me like he's a nonviolent protester. And we had them too, by the way, in first century. So I have no problem with that. In fact, if I found out tomorrow that somebody, without any questions about it, said, I think Jesus is the Son of God, and he said it in the year 29, that would not surprise me, because every coin, silver coin they had, says Caesar was the Son of God. So, you know, you don't have to have Nicaea for somebody to say, well, you know, I don't care about what's his face over in Rome. This is my Son of God right here. So I'm much less interested in titles than in programs. And once I get the program right of what Jesus is up to, then by all means, put the titles. But don't use the titles or debates about the title to excuse you from participating in the program.